welcome to Books in Action. My name is Larry Petraccaro, and I have with me today Dan Barry. Dan is a writer, an author, a columnist, a reporter for the New York Times, and he has actually been in reporting, writing, I guess now for some, 20 or 30 years, but 30 years maybe. Started with Manchester, Connecticut, went on to Providence, Rhode Island before becoming to the New York Times. And while he was in Providence, he and his team won a Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting. Dan has also been a finalist 2 other times for the Pulitzer Prize. So with that, we're going to get started. Dan's also written 5 books, and we hope to talk about them a little bit later. But we're recording this in the time remotely because we're all kind of locked down in this time of the coronavirus. And Dan, you wrote a column recently because you've had a personal experience, I think, with some of the anxieties or decisions that people now have to make. It was perhaps not specifically COVID-19 dependent, but the pandemic certainly had an impact on your personal story. So can you tell us a little bit about that, and also, why you chose to write about it and share that with us?
Sure. I live in Maplewood. I married a Maplewood woman. She grew up here. Her name is Mary Trinity. Her father still lives on Burnett Street, just down the street from the middle school and the library. And anyone who's been in Maplewood for any amount of time may know the Trinity name. There were 5 children. They played sports. They were very involved at Columbia. He taught at Jonathan Dayton Regional High School in Springfield, and he still lives at Burnett Street. So he's 92 years old, and with that comes some challenges. And a couple of months ago, he fell and broke a hip, and so that meant that he went to the hospital, and then he had to go to a rehab center. And so when he went to the hospital and then to the rehab center, it was sort of at the beginning of the pandemic, but it was definitely serious by then. So we visited him several times at the rehab center, and then suddenly the decision came down at the rehab center that there would be no more visitors. So I think this challenge is familiar to a lot of people who have older people in their families, with fathers and mothers and so on. And so my wife and her siblings were faced with this challenge. Well, what do we do? We can't, if we leave our father in this facility, we won't be able to visit him. And we know that this virus is coming, and that sadly it also attacks institutions like nursing homes and rehab centers. So there was a lot of discussion about this. What's the best thing to do? And then finally, they decided we have to get him out of there. So the family arranged to have an ambulance come to the rehab center, and I was there. I don't know if I thought I would write about it then, but I wanted to bear witness anyway, as my father-in-law, whom I love, was coming out of the facility. So I was there. It's a facility in Livingston, and he comes out on the gurney, and he's about to be lifted into the ambulance. And the first thing he says is, "How is everybody?" Not him, but how is everybody else? Which is, I guess, the right question for a patriarch. And so then he went home, and the family had set up a bed in the dining room where who knows how many family meals had taken place. I know I've been there hundreds of times. And the family has been dealing with this ever since, for a good month and a half now. The facility he left, sadly, has been overrun with the virus, with more than 70 confirmed cases. So in retrospect, I think it was clearly the right move, not only because of the approaching virus, but also because the family wanted to be together. So it's not, I can't say it's been easy. There are challenges. He's had some physical challenges that we need to deal with, but he's fine. And the other day he was on the back deck watching me shoot baskets in the basketball in the back. And a couple of days ago, he was out in the middle of Burnett Street in his wheelchair, talking to neighbors, which is remarkable considering where he was several weeks ago.
Oh, I'm glad that worked out for you the way you had wanted to. I was curious because when I read the article, there seemed to be some kind of conflict that you talked about between making, if I remember correctly, making kind of rational decisions as opposed to emotional decisions. And it sounds like, I don't know what the decision-making process was for Mary and her brothers and sisters, but it certainly, in retrospect, with what you said about what happened up at the facility, seems to have been a very rational decision, because sometimes those decisions seem colder than when you make them.
I would say that what I wrote really kind of captured that moment, because there was no certainty that he would be all right. There was no certainty that once he was brought home, that the family could cobble together the care that he would need. I mean, that's one of the reasons he was in the rehab center. He required particular kinds of therapy that none of us is trained to provide. So what would be best for him? Would he heal better in the rehab center, or would he be all right at home when we know that this virus, and back then it was still, if you look back at that time, there was still a real surreal feel about it, because when you went out, and even today, if you go out, it's not as though you can see this threat, right? Everything else seems normal. We're living in a state of normal. We're living in a state of suspended disbelief, right? And so that's where we were at that time. So there were these factors of, is it really coming? We know it's coming, but is it really? And also his physical challenges, and looking outside and seeing nothing different from 2 weeks earlier. So it was pretty complicated in retrospect. Now it looks like a clear and obvious decision. It really wasn't at that point.
Yeah, I would imagine no decisions, or when you're going through them and you're looking forward, you can't predict. The future's hard to predict, I suppose. Would you, as a reporter, columnist, and author, would you approach this story differently if you were writing in any one of those roles, so to speak? Or are they that different, I guess, is maybe a better question.
No, I would approach it the same way. The challenge, though, for me as a nonfiction writer, right? Any attempts at fiction have been mortifying. So let's just leave it there. So in order to write nonfiction, I'm trained to bear witness. I'm trained to be there. I'm trained to try and get into the skin and the interior lives of the people I write about. And sadly now, that is much more of an obstacle, because I'm not supposed to be outside. I'm not supposed to go places. I am going to Queens tomorrow to report on something, but I'm stopping at the New York Times first to collect all sorts of PPE equipment before I go out there. And I have to tell you that, at another time, going out to Queens would be an ordinary endeavor. Now, I have to admit, it's quite anxiety inducing. So the whole nature of reporting has changed given this pandemic, because, do I go into that person's apartment to talk to that person about how she lived through the virus? Am I putting myself at risk? Am I putting my family at risk? That's what's different this time, I think, and most journalists would tell you the same.
Mm-hmm. So the things that I read and of some of the things you've written, you seem to have a real empathy or interest in the humanity of a story and the people themselves. Is that been something long-standing, or am I misinterpreting this?
No, that's what I've always been drawn to, are the is to take a large issue, say it's the pandemic we're living through, or 9/11, or Hurricane Katrina, or the recession, and try to tell that story through a human being, taking that, identifying with a person, and joining that person's journey through this crisis, because I think it becomes much realer. It's not a public policy piece, and people, no matter what walk of life they come from, they will identify with that person. That's what I try to do, so that when I tell you about someone who has lost a loved one in 9/11, or someone who has just lived through the flooding in Katrina, you can feel the grief, you can feel the wet, and therefore it becomes all the more real. So yes, I'm drawn to that. Yeah.
That makes me think of a question that it's kind of been running around in my mind for a while, is whether, between fact and truth, whether the facts of Hurricane Katrina or the facts of the pandemic are one thing, but the truth of it might be more to what you're getting at with how the people feel. You mentioned you could feel the wet and that kind of thing. It's like sometimes you read a good book, and it's if it's about the Southwest, you can almost feel the dry and dusty environment around you. So how do you reconcile those two things if the facts don't get the truth of what you're trying to get across?
I think it's how you present the facts, and the proper and judicious use of facts. As journalists, we're not stenographers. I'm not going to provide you with a laundry list of everything I've seen, but it's by choosing the details and the facts properly to approach the truth, right? And oftentimes, so for example, with Katrina, what I was trying to convey often was the sense of despair, or in the early days of Katrina, the sense of chaos, the sense of anarchy, that there was no one in control. And the way I was able to do that, or attempted to do that, was to describe what I saw, which would be none of the traffic lights working. And so cars were going the wrong way down one-way streets, and people were armed, and you just had a sense of things being out of control. So with those facts, you then can build something that frames the truth.
Okay, I'd like to follow up on that, but we're going to have to take a break, if we may, for a minute, Dan. But when we come back, I'd like to follow up on that, because I know you've done traveling around the country. You've written columns about that, I think, This Land, and you've written a book. And one of the things I'm curious about is the way people react in different parts of the country. I read some of what you've written about people in New York City, and there are certainly a few characters in it. But if we can hold off, I'd like to follow up on that. So we'll be back in a minute. Just stay with us.
It's an onion.
Welcome back to Books in Action. This is Larry Petraccaro with Dan Barry, and we were talking with Dan a little bit about his writing, obviously, but we were talking about the truth and the facts, and how he can convey, or will try to convey, the truth of something, even if the facts don't give the emotional involvement, because that is something that Dan finds very compelling, is the human interest, the human nature aspect of things. And just before the break, we were talking about what things might be like in different parts of the country. And Dan, that's what I'd like to ask you. I mean, we see this, as a country, it almost seems like instead of we're being pulled together to fight a common foe, in this case, the coronavirus, we're being pulled apart, or we're acting differently. And I just wonder if, in your travels around the country, you've ever seen or noticed differences in whether people think more of independence or self-reliance or they carry guns, whatever it might be, if you find it that there are things that kind of cultural differences in different parts of the country that might have explain some of what we see today.
Yeah. When I haven't been traveling the country for a couple of years now. I used to travel effectively every week and go to some other part of the country. And, Larry, what I would often find would be the similarities among us rather than differences. I suppose I really wasn't looking for the cracks. I thought that the cracks were kind of stipulated. And so therefore I was looking for the similarities. But I will tell you that, the New York Times reporters and a lot of reporters around the country have gone back to 2016 and questioned, did we miss something? Were we not capturing what was going on? And I remember being in Pennsylvania to visit the Flight 93 Memorial, which is the site where one of the planes went down on 9/11. And I was in Pennsylvania, and I saw several Confederate flags. Okay. Now, in retrospect, I saw a lot of Trump signs, not a lot of Hillary signs, but I saw Confederate flags. Why are there Confederate flags in Pennsylvania? Pennsylvania was in the north, as I recall. So that, in retrospect, and I mentioned it in the column that I wound up writing, but I didn't really dwell on it. But I've often thought about that and whether I should have drilled down more, because that to me it was a reflection of what you're driving at, about the schisms that we're seeing now. So for example, in the news today, someone is trying to catch CBS News for overinflating something about the test sites and how many people were waiting, right? Like we're going to catch somebody overemphasizing the seriousness of this virus. I don't know where that comes from. The virus is damn serious, and yet there seems to be a part of the country trying to downplay it for some reason, and I don't get that. I really, honestly don't get that, and it's quite disturbing, quite disturbing.
Well, kind of not to follow up, but to corroborate what you're saying. I used to work at one point in my career. I worked out in Phillipsburg, New Jersey, which is in New Jersey. It's on the Delaware River, and what I found so interesting was how different it was. Probably less than 50 miles away from here, and it was different. So I often thought to myself that this little area around New York City is not the world writ large. It is to us, but it's kind of like a bubble. But in any event, I appreciate that, and I kind of, it's been kind of a thought of mine. Like you think about it, I have often wondered. I'd be more interested in what brings us together, but unfortunately, it seems like it's easier to tear things down than to build them up, I suppose, and it takes less energy these days to do anything like that. So, but yeah, Confederate flags, I suppose we'd find them down in Ocean County too, for that matter. So,
Well, that's also an indication of the strangeness of New Jersey. Parts of it seem to be below the Mason-Dixon line at times. The difference between southern New Jersey and northern New Jersey is profound.
Yeah, I agree. And now we've got the new possible central New Jersey that we're going to have to worry about. Well, if we're home, self-isolating or whatever it is we have to do, in the reading you've done, is there anything you might suggest that's appropriate for this particular set of circumstances we find ourselves in, either about the plague? I could think of a couple of books, or maybe ones that we don't want to think about the plague. Any thoughts?
It's interesting. My daughter was suggesting I read Wolf Hall, and I began reading it. I know it's a singular piece of work, but it's sort of like with 9/11. I haven't been to the 9/11 Museum and Memorial, and that's not out of disrespect. It's just that I lived through it and was very intimate with it, and I don't really need to. I live it in my own way, And so here we are in a pandemic, and after a long day of reporting about the pandemic, the idea of relaxing with a book about the plague
Okay.
doesn't appeal to me necessarily. So what I've actually found is I'm like watching that documentary about Michael Jordan, anything that's unrelated to the dark news of the day.
Well, that's interesting. I guess that maybe that's a more sensible approach to take. Is I would just think I belonged to a book club and have for years, and two of the books that came to mind were The Betrothed by a guy named Manzoni, which is about the plague in Milan, the Black Plague in Milan. Well, another one is The Decameron, and the third one was The Plague by Camus. So,
Right.
If anybody who's listening wants to read books about the plague, there's three. There's
Right.
three.
Right, the Decameron, right. I think a friend of mine is trying to do an updated version of the Decameron, so that's worth it.
Really, yeah. We had one of the people in our club suggested we do that. So about 5 of us wrote stories, but we're certainly not professionals at it. That's what I can say. I know you wrote the book about the longest baseball game, the bottom of the 33rd. Are there any lessons? Are there any similarities or lessons in that with the persistence, the doggedness that those people had to go through that we can apply to what's going on today?
I do. I think that, I was just talking to some people in Jackson Heights. Jackson Heights, Queens is a very, very diverse part of this country. Jackson Heights and Elmhurst may be the single most diverse place in the world. There's about 160 languages and dialects being spoken there. And I was speaking actually to a Sherpa. And what he was telling me was, it struck me, and it reminds me now that you brought it up of the bottom of the 33rd, and it's about resilience. It's about facing some, and in the bottom of the 33rd, we're talking about a baseball game that went too long, right? So that's not really challenging so much, but the principles are the same. And what he spoke about, the Sherpa spoke about mostly, was about the volunteers coming together, working really hard to find masks, to find Tylenol. They need Tylenol to create little care packages to get to people in the community who couldn't summon the strength even to come outside, okay? And so that Sherpa wasn't the only person. I've talked to several people in Jackson Heights, and I think this is happening around the country, where people are volunteering and helping one another, which flies in the face of the partisanship that we were talking about earlier. That, there is this real well of good feeling and love for one another and care for one another. And I think that's what will hopefully be most remembered at this time, how we took care of one another.
Yeah, I certainly hope you're right. As a observer of of humanity, if you will, of the human condition, do you have any opinions as to what might be different post-pandemic than from what we have now? What might be the same, or do you think ultimately everything will be smoothed out and it'll be back what it was before?
I don't know. I remember Graydon Carter saying after 9/11 that irony was dead. Do you remember that? Irony didn't die from 9/11. I think I've often thought this, that people are saying, oh, now because of the sheltering in place, we're way more comfortable with working at home, that this will affect commercial real estate prices, that people will rather be working remotely, and that may be a profound change in our culture. I wonder if it's actually the opposite, that we have spent so much time at home that we're going stir crazy and we crave the company of others, right?
Yeah.
And that we're willing to deal. I never thought I would get nostalgic about NJ Transit, right? Never, right? But here, there's a part of me saying, you know what? I like being in the company. I'm not talking about my family. I love my family. And actually, this has been really a powerful moment for our family unit, and a loving one. But there is also a part of us that needs to be among others. And so that's the counterintuitive thought about what might result from this pandemic. I'm not going to say it's going to be, parades for NJ Transit now, but I think there will be this moment, and it won't last, but there'll be this moment where we're grateful to be on NJ Transit.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of wish I could go to some of the museums. I'd be happy to be on NJ Transit too,
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, I think it's almost an unfair question because none of us know what could happen, and you're absolutely right that I'm not sure there is any conventional wisdom. For one thing, this isn't conventional, right? We're dealing with something so different. They say people are doing more cooking at home. I've gotten the habit now of baking bread. For some reason, I find it interesting. It's got nothing to do with books. But I have this roughly 2-hour period of time where I have to hang around and kind of knead it every 20 minutes. So I've had a chance to catch up on a lot of TV, which was for me kind of helpful. We only have a little bit about more than a minute, so this is going to have to be quick. I'm sorry, Dan, but of the books you've written, and I think there's been 5 of them, is there any one that's your particular favorite?
I wrote a book about men with intellectual disability called
Right.
The Bunkhouse. And it was about a bunch of men in Texas who were basically dragooned into working at a meat processing plant in Iowa. And they effectively lost their entire lives while working in servitude. And yet they overcame it ultimately after they were rescued. And one of the gentlemen that I wrote about, Willie Levi, in fact, died the other day because of the virus. And I think about this poor guy, 73 years old. He spent most of his life either in an institution or in servitude. And then he finally gets 10 years of retirement only to die of the virus. For some reason, that book is sticking out in my mind now, and it may be because of Willie Levi. And I think about how resolute he was, how resilient, how determined he was to have joy in his life after so much misery. So that's what I would say.
Okay, well, that's probably, we're going to have to end this interview, and I want to thank you for joining us. I guess that's a good way. We could probably talk more about, let's hope that resoluteness, that resilience that they displayed, we're going to be able to display as well.
I agree.
So, Dan, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope to see you again sometime. I'm sure
we
can.
Thank you. Thanks. I enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Okay, bye now.
Bye-bye.
And thank you for joining us on Books in Action.